The silver ribbon on the dark velvet ring box slipped loose, but it was the thick stack of legal papers hidden beneath the silk lining that made my sister scream. Her shriek pierced the speaker of my phone, sharp enough to make me flinch and pull the device away from my ear, drowning out the faint, elegant sound of a string quartet playing in the background. I sat on a sun-drenched balcony 3,000 miles away in Malibu, California. The cold metal of the phone case bit into my palm. I breathed in the heavy, rich scent of ocean salt and blooming jasmine, trying to steady my racing heart while I watched my family unravel live on screen. On the glowing display, hundreds of elegantly dressed wedding guests froze in their seats, their champagne glasses suspended in midair. My cousin Aaron, who was hiding in the back row holding the camera, let out a sharp gasp. Kelsey dropped the brass key that had been resting on top of the documents. It clattered loudly against the polished hardwood floor of the country club, spinning until it came to a dead stop near the hem of her expensive white gown. My sister stared at the papers spilled across the floor. She recognized them instantly. Of course she did, because 6 weeks ago she and my parents had used my name to forge them. That exact same brass key had felt warm in my pocket 6 weeks earlier as I unlocked the front door of my bungalow in Southern Pines, North Carolina. I nudged the heavy wooden door open with my shoulder, dropping my combat boots by the entryway mat. A familiar, dull ache in my lower back reminded me of another 14-hour day managing supply chains, vehicle convoys, and equipment logistics at Fort Liberty. I was 38 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and my absolute favorite part of the day was always this quiet, solid click of the deadbolt sliding into place. This was my own house. I had spent hours picking the perfect shade of sage green paint for the hallway. I had spent entire weekends building the oak bookshelves in the living room, carefully sanding the wood until it was smooth under my fingertips. I walked past the spare bedroom, pausing in the doorway to catch the comforting scent of fresh linen and new pine furniture. I had cleared the space entirely over the weekend, stripping away the old guest bed and preparing it for a young female soldier who needed temporary housing after a tough overseas deployment. Down the hall, my logistics consulting business plan sat open on the kitchen island. The pages were covered in bright pink sticky notes and highlighted budget projections for the company I planned to launch after my military service ended. I poured a tall glass of ice water, enjoying the condensation freezing against my skin, and checked my email out of pure habit. I scrolled through the routine property alerts I had set up months ago. Routine and order kept me grounded in a life that often felt chaotic. My phone vibrated violently against the granite counter, shattering the quiet peace of the house. A text message from my mother lit up the locked screen. "Kelsey is panicking about the wedding money," the message read. "Call us on video. Now." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, took a deep breath, and tapped the video call button. My mother, Linda, appeared instantly on the laptop screen, sitting rigidly on her pristine white living room sofa. My father, Gerald, hovered directly behind her, his thick arms crossed defensively over his chest. Kelsey squeezed next to our mother, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. The venue costs went up again, Kelsey sniffled, her voice tight and climbing an octave to that familiar pitch of engineered distress. "We are completely out of budget, and the caterer wants the final deposit by Friday, or they are canceling the entire menu." My father leaned into the frame, completely ignoring my uniform and the dark circles of exhaustion written clearly on my face. "You have that 3-bedroom house, Tessa. It is almost paid off, and it is far too big for just one person anyway. Kelsey and Owen need a place to start their lives together. They were asking me to sign over my home, just like that, as casually as if I were a distant relative holding onto a spare bicycle they suddenly wanted to borrow for the weekend." I kept my voice perfectly level, leaning forward so they could see my face clearly under the kitchen pendant lights. "I offered a $10,000 wedding gift. I can help her budget the remaining costs and negotiate a better rate with the vendors. I did not offer my future. My mother sighed, deploying that heavy, breathy exhale. She always used to signal deep disappointment to the entire neighborhood. You are making your sister feel unloved, Tessa. You have a great career in the military. You do not need all this empty space. Family takes care of family, sweetheart. I looked at the three of them on the screen, a united front built entirely on my ongoing compliance. The phrase echoed in my head like a bad song on repeat. Family takes care of family. I remembered the sharp, sterile scent of hospital antiseptic from 5 years ago when I took an entire month of military leave to bathe and feed my father after his knee surgery. I remembered the rough, textured paper of the cashier check I wrote to cover my parents' overdue property taxes, back when Gerald claimed his construction business was struggling. I remembered Kelsey crying hysterically on my porch over her college tuition bill, a bill I paid in full from my deployment savings, so she would not drop out of her senior year. Every single time, I told myself it was a one-time crisis. I stepped in to fix the leak, and they simply folded my sacrifice into their baseline expectations. I was not a daughter to them. I was a crisis management fund. I ended the call with a quiet goodnight, completely ignoring Kelsey as she started to raise her voice again. Sitting alone in my quiet kitchen, I opened my secure banking app. I stared at my savings account for a long minute, then transferred a small but deliberate sum of money into my newly established business account. It was a tiny action, invisible to the rest of the world, but it belonged entirely to me. I was officially done paying for their manufactured emergencies. The next afternoon, I was reviewing a complicated supply manifest at my desk on base when an unfamiliar local number lit up my cell phone screen. I stepped out into the quiet hallway of the command center to answer. Marisol Vega introduced herself as a title officer for a local real estate firm. Her computer keyboard clicked rhythmically in the background. "We are calling to verify a transfer request on your Southern Pines property," she said, her tone professional but laced with a very slight hesitation. "Did you authorize Gerald Monroe to transfer your property to Kelsey Monroe?" My chest tightened, a cold, heavy knot forming right behind my ribs. The instinct to panic flared hot in my throat, but years of military logistics training immediately took over. I did not raise my voice, and I did not accuse anyone on the open line. "What is the file name?" I asked, pulling a black pen from my uniform pocket and writing frantically on the back of a lunch receipt. "When did you receive it? Who sent it?" I need absolutely everything sent to my email in writing immediately. Marisol paused, the typing stopping abruptly. "The deed has not been recorded yet. There is no financial consideration listed on the paperwork, meaning no money is changing hands. The recipient is listed as an immediate family member, and your specific property alert required direct phone verification before we process anything further." I thanked her, hung up the phone, and drove straight home. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the windshield of my truck, but my hands felt entirely numb wrapped around the steering wheel. When I finally walked through my front door, I ignored my boots and went straight to the hall closet. I pulled out my heavy fireproof safe. The metal dial clicked smoothly under my fingers, a comforting mechanical sound in a suddenly unstable world. I reached inside the dark compartment and pulled out my real limited power of attorney, the exact legal document I had left with my parents during my last overseas deployment so they could handle my vehicle registration and forward my basic mail. Marisol sent the email while I was still holding the original document. I opened the PDF attachment on my laptop and placed my real paper copy right next to the glowing screen. The document my family had submitted to the title company looked perfectly authentic at first glance. It had my full name, my correct address, and the proper notary stamp on the final page. But right in the middle, there was an extra page, a densely worded paragraph explicitly authorizing the transfer, gift, or disposal of real estate. I leaned in closer, my nose inches from the monitor. The page numbers were misaligned, sitting a quarter of an inch too high compared to the rest of the document. My initials were missing from the bottom right corner of that specific inserted page. They had not just asked for my house during that video call. They had already started a transaction to take it before I ever said no. The realization did not make me scream or cry. It felt exactly like walking confidently through a door and finding out the floor had been entirely removed. My father had used a modified document. My mother had distracted me with a coordinated guilt trip. My sister was simply waiting at the finish line to claim the prize. I did not pick up the phone to call my parents and demand angry answers. Anger is loud, but logistics require total silence. I took a high-resolution screenshot of the fake document. I downloaded the original file directly from the email server. I saved a secure copy to an encrypted flash drive, using the exact file naming conventions the Army taught me. Only after the evidence was entirely locked down did I open a web browser and search for a civilian real estate and fraud attorney in the area. I dialed the number for Naomi Price. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and alert. I explained the extra page, the warning call from the title company, and the property alert that caught the fraudulent transaction in transit. She listened without interrupting me once, asking only for me to forward the email from Marisol. I heard the soft, steady hum of the computer fan through the phone speaker as Naomi opened the file. She was silent for a long moment, the heavy quiet stretching out endlessly between us. "Tessa," Naomi finally said, her tone stripping away any lingering hope I had of this being a simple clerical misunderstanding. "This is not family pressure anymore. Someone has already used your name." The silence stretched across the cellular connection. My finger hovered over the red end call button, and for a fleeting second, the instinct to dial my father overwhelmed my logistics training. I wanted to scream through the phone, to demand an explanation from the man who taught me how to ride a bicycle. Instead, I placed the device face down on the granite counter. The cold stone seeped through my uniform sleeves while I drew a slow breath. The next morning, I sat across from Naomi Price in her downtown civil law office. The room smelled of fresh coffee and lemon polish, a sharp contrast to the stale air of a military briefing room. Naomi pushed a yellow legal pad across her mahogany desk, tapping a silver pen against the margin. "The original power of attorney does not grant real estate transfer rights," the attorney explained, keeping her tone perfectly even. "That fake version needs to be formally challenged. Before we do anything else, we have to stop the closing process and preserve every single piece of data in the system." I nodded, pulling a fresh folder from my leather satchel. My hands remained steady as I slid the signed revocation letter across the desk. Even though the original document was set to expire soon, we filed an immediate official revocation. Naomi sent formal notices to the title company and every party who had previously accepted the old version. "Do not call your parents and threaten them," Naomi warned, catching my eye. "Do not tell them they are going to jail. We need them comfortable enough to leave a paper trail." That afternoon, I decided to test the waters. Sitting in my parked truck outside the base commissary, I opened the family group chat. I typed a single, deliberate sentence. "Before I decide anything about the house, send me every document connected to this transfer." My mother replied less than 3 minutes later. Linda flooded the screen with heart emojis, entirely convinced my request meant a surrender. "Oh, sweetheart, I knew you would do the right thing for your sister. We are so proud of you," Kelsey chimed in shortly after. My sister sent a single portable document format file. I opened the attachment carefully, scanning the pages. It was completely sanitized. The file contained only basic property transfer request forms, conveniently missing the deed and any financial paperwork. "I need a few days to look this over," I typed back. I saved Kelsey's message to a new encrypted folder on my phone, noting exactly how she framed the transaction as a simple gift. My father called my private cell phone later that evening. Gerald bypassed the group chat entirely, using the low, practical voice he always deployed when managing a difficult construction client. "Tessa, this is just paperwork to keep our options open," he said, the sound of a television playing softly in the background of his living room. "You know how much your mother and I have done for you over the years. We took care of you when you were sick as a child, and we always made sure you had a roof over your head. This house will stay in the family." My chest tightened at the weaponized memories, but I focused on the information gap. I kept my voice perfectly neutral, asking open questions just like a careful investigator. "Who prepared this file, Dad? Who gets the mail after the closing? When exactly did you start this process?" He dodged the specifics, shifting the conversation back to the wedding venue costs. But then he slipped. He sighed loudly into the receiver. "The lender needs it before the rehearsal dinner, Tessa. Just sign the final page so we can all move on." I did not argue. I did not ask him to repeat the word lender. I simply said goodbye, ended the call, and wrote the word down on a notepad in thick black ink. The following morning, Marisol from the title company forwarded the remaining file history to my secure email. I sat at my home office desk, sipping black coffee while I scrolled through the attachments. There was a quitclaim deed in the stack, but my signature was missing. Instead, my father had signed the line. Gerald had signed his own name, explicitly claiming his status as my legal representative. He directed the title company to name Kelsey as the sole recipient. The mailing address for all future property tax bills was listed as my parents' suburban home. Tucked beneath the deed, a single closing instruction sheet contained Kelsey's email address and the name of a private lending firm located in Charlotte. My father did not just know about the fake document. He had actively used a non-existent legal authority to sign my property away. That realization severed a very old, very deep tie inside my chest. I closed the laptop, grabbed my car keys, and drove straight to my local bank branch. Taking back control required physical action, not just legal defense. Inside the quiet vault room, I rented a large safe deposit box. I placed my birth certificate, the real property deed, and my original military documents into the metal drawer, locking it with a heavy brass key. From the bank, I drove to the post office and paid cash for a private post office box, ensuring my family could no longer intercept my mail. Sitting in the post office parking lot, I opened my military personnel portal on my phone. I deleted Linda as my primary emergency contact, replacing her name with Maya, my closest friend from my previous deployment. My mother no longer had the right to be notified if my life was in danger. I spent the next 2 hours finalizing the state registration for my logistics consulting firm. I scheduled my very first client meeting for the following week, typing the appointment into my calendar with deliberate force. I was not just building a defense against my family. I was building a door they could not walk through. The sun was sinking below the pine trees when Naomi called. Her number flashed on the truck dashboard screen, and I answered over the vehicle speaker system. "We have a major complication," the attorney said, her voice lacking its usual smooth cadence. "The private lender received our fraud notice and stopped the closing. However, they informed us that they already disbursed a significant portion of a loan based on the approved family transfer." I gripped the steering wheel, the leather cold under my palms. "What collateral did they use?" I asked, my mind racing through property law basics. "Your house cannot serve as valid collateral because the transfer was never completed," Naomi explained, the sound of rustling paper echoing through the speaker. "The title company flagged it in time. But the lender issued a private bridge loan based on personal guarantees. Kelsey promised to complete the lien immediately after the title transferred to her name. If the transfer fails, the lender can demand the entire amount back instantly. My sister had borrowed cash against a house she did not own, using a fake document to float the illusion of impending ownership." The phone hummed quietly while I processed the financial disaster. I took a deep breath, watching the evening shadows stretch across the asphalt. Kelsey is going to owe them a lot of money, I said, feeling a strange detachment from my sister's impending ruin. Naomi paused. Her silence felt incredibly heavy, thick with information she was holding back. I need you to look at your email, Tessa. I just forwarded the loan package summary from the lender. Look at the borrower signatures on page 4. I put the truck in park and picked up my phone. The screen illuminated the dark cab as I opened the encrypted attachment. I scrolled past the loan terms, past the massive principal amount, down to the final signature block. Kelsey had signed the primary borrower line in bright blue ink, but she was not alone on the page. Directly below my sister's looping handwriting, my father and my mother had both signed their full legal names as personal guarantors. All three of them had tied their own financial survival to a house that never belonged to them. The 3 signatures glowed on my phone screen, illuminating the dark cab of my truck and cementing a reality I could no longer ignore. My parents and my sister had bound themselves to a massive financial anchor, and they had used my home to weave the rope. The following morning, I sat at my kitchen island with a printed copy of the complete loan summary Naomi had sent over. The paper felt heavy in my hands, the crisp black ink detailing the exact price of my family's deception. The private lender had approved a bridge loan for $72,000. According to the disbursement log, $64,000 had already vanished into various vendor accounts, while the remaining $8,000 sat frozen, pending final proof of the title transfer. I traced the outgoing wire transfers with the cap of my pen, listening to the quiet hum of my refrigerator. $10,000 went to a luxury country club for the venue deposit. $8,000 went to a boutique floral designer. $5,000 secured a photographer, and another massive chunk covered a non-refundable honeymoon deposit to an exclusive resort in the Maldives. They had transformed the roof over my head into a promise to pay for an extravagant party, a celebration where I was treated as nothing more than an afterthought. My laptop chimed, breaking the quiet morning air. A new email appeared in my personal inbox, sent by an upscale wedding coordination company based in Charlotte. I opened the message and read the opening line twice. The coordinator wanted to express her deepest gratitude for the generous property gift that made the beautiful celebration possible. A cold knot tightened behind my ribs, but I kept my fingers steady on the keyboard. I typed a polite, brief reply, clarifying that I had never gifted any real estate and requested that the vendor preserve all previous correspondence for their own legal protection. Less than 10 minutes later, the coordinator replied in an absolute panic. She forwarded an older email chain, and there, in plain text, Kelsey had assured the planning team my sister was spending borrowed money, and she was using my reputation to reassure the people cashing the checks. I needed to give them a chance to stop before the damage became permanent. That evening, I initiated a group video call, sitting straight-backed in my home office. Kelsey, Linda, and Gerald appeared on the screen, clustered around the dining room table in my childhood home. The familiar floral wallpaper behind them looked exactly the same as it had when I was 10 years old, a comforting backdrop for a deeply uncomfortable conversation. I did not mention the fraud alert, the attorney, or the missing thousands of dollars. I simply laid out 3 specific conditions. Withdraw every document bearing my name, inform the lender of the actual ownership status, and provide a written statement acknowledging that the house was never a wedding gift. If they complied before the end of the week, I promised to keep the dispute entirely private and still provide my original $10,000 cash gift. Kelsey immediately buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with loud, theatrical sobs. "You are trying to humiliate me because you are jealous," she cried, her voice echoing sharply through my computer speakers. "You always want to ruin my special moments." My father leaned forward, placing a heavy hand on Kelsey's shoulder. "Tessa, you are making this far too complicated," he said, using his deepest, most reasonable tone. "We just need your signature to clean up the paperwork. It is just a formality for the bank. and family takes care of family. They refused the exit route. I ended the call without another word, closing the laptop and watching the screen go black. 30 seconds later, my phone vibrated against the wooden desk. A text message from my mother illuminated the dark room, and her words finally crossed the boundary from implication to a direct threat. Transfer ownership of your $300,000 house to your sister if you want to attend her wedding, the message read. A second text arrived immediately after, this one from Kelsey. Your seat at the head table is gone, my sister wrote. Do not bother showing up in your uniform just to steal the attention either. I stared at the glowing letters. A small, strange smile touched the corners of my mouth. I was not smiling out of joy, but out of pure relief. For decades, they had operated in the shadows of passive aggression and deniability. Now, they had finally written their demands in permanent ink. I took a screenshot of both messages, forwarded the images to Naomi, and added them to my growing timeline of evidence. I opened my military personnel portal, navigating to my leave balance. For the past 15 years, I had hoarded my vacation days like emergency rations, deploying them only when Gerald needed surgery or Linda demanded help hosting a holiday event. The upcoming week had been blocked off to manage Kelsey's wedding logistics, run errands, and handle the inevitable family meltdowns. I clicked the modification button. I canceled my flight to Charlotte and booked a quiet bungalow in Malibu, California, located just 3 miles from where Maya lived. I did not book a luxury suite to show off or act out. I simply secured a quiet place with a view of the ocean, scheduled a virtual meeting with my small business advisor, and blocked out an entire afternoon for a walk on the beach. It was the first time in my adult life that I had chosen my own peace over their manufactured chaos. I typed my credit card information into the airline website, listening to the rhythmic clicking of the keys, feeling the heavy weight of obligations slowly lifting from my shoulders. The confirmation email for my flight had just arrived when Naomi called my cell phone. Her voice held a sharp, dangerous edge. The lender just provided the complete file, the attorney said, the sound of flipping pages coming through the line. There is a sworn affidavit in here, and it was not signed by your father or your sister. I listened carefully, watching a stray dog trot across my front lawn through the office window. Tell me, I said quietly. Your mother signed a statement under penalty of perjury, Naomi explained. Linda swore to the bank that you had agreed to gift the house months ago, and she claimed you were simply unable to sign the paperwork in person because of sudden military deployment orders. A memory struck me with the force of a physical blow. 3 weeks ago, my mother had called to casually ask about my upcoming deployment schedule. I had thought she was showing maternal concern, checking in on my safety. Instead, she had been gathering the necessary details to build a bulletproof lie. My mother, the woman who spent my entire childhood preaching about family unity and Christian values, had actively provided false testimony to legitimize a fraudulent loan. Naomi sent the document over. I opened the file and scrolled to the bottom of the page. Right beneath my mother's elegant, cursive signature, a final sentence sat neatly typed on the crisp white paper. My daughter Tessa asked us to act quickly before she changed her mind. The glow of the laptop screen faded into sleep mode, leaving my kitchen plunged into shadows. I reached out, tracing the raised lettering on a thick stack of printed documents spread across the oak dining table. These papers formed a physical timeline of my family's deception, and I spent the quiet hours of the morning organizing them by date. Next to the forged deed, an old, faded graduation card sat propped against a coffee mug. Kelsey had given it to me over a decade ago. The inside flap bore her loopy handwriting, spelling out a phrase that now tasted completely sour in my mouth. You always fix everything. The faint, sterile scent of hospital bleach suddenly hit my memory, bringing back the dark bags under my eyes when I flew cross-country for my father's knee surgery. I remembered the heavy silence in the car when I handed my mother the cashier check for her overdue vehicle deposit, and the way Kelsey had cried on my porch when her college tuition came due. Every single time I had stepped in willingly, but those individual choices had somehow calcified into an unwritten family law. They relied on my competence to bankroll their comfort, turning my love into a permanent line of credit. My cell phone vibrated, rattling against the hardwood table and startling me out of the past. The screen displayed my mother's name, and when I answered, her voice drifted through the speaker soft and sweet, carrying that familiar lilt she saved for Sunday church service. "We just want our family to stay together," she murmured, acting as though a minor misunderstanding had occurred instead of a massive financial fraud. "Then why did you sign a sworn document saying I had already agreed to give away my home?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. A long, heavy pause filled the cellular connection. "Your father said it was just a formality to keep the options open," Linda finally whispered, retreating behind her husband's authority just as she always did. I did not confront her with the evidence of her own typed instructions to act quickly. Instead, I pressed a different angle, asking if she knew the bank loan had already paid for the country club. She gasped softly, the sound catching in her throat. "Kelsey could not lose the venue after all those deposits were made," she said, her defense slipping out before she could build a proper lie around it. The call ended a moment later, and I immediately wrote her exact words on a yellow legal pad, securing the admission in thick black ink. Sunlight began to stream through the kitchen blinds by the time Naomi called with a crucial update. The attorney sounded energized, her words clipping along at a brisk professional pace. "The notary listed on the fake power of attorney just confirmed her journal has no entry for that date," Naomi explained, the rustle of paper echoing over the line. "She never met you, and the stamp appears to be digitally copied from an older, legitimate document." I pulled up my own military travel logs on my tablet, verifying my location with absolute certainty. On the exact date stamped next to the forged signature, I had been standing in a staging area at a duty station entirely across the country. The physical impossibility locked another heavy door on their lies. But a copied stamp was only one piece of the puzzle, and the digital footprint proved far more damning. Later that afternoon, the private lender pulled the audit trail directly from their secure loan portal. According to the system logs, the borrower account registered to my sister had uploaded the altered document weeks after the date written on the physical paper. The portal recorded the original file name as Wedding House Transfer Final, complete with a digital timestamp that placed Kelsey squarely behind the keyboard. No one had hacked a personal device, because the lender only needed to look at the history of their own receiving platform. "It is a solid chain," Naomi said over the phone, reminding me that the audit trail alone was not the entire case. The strength came from weaving the digital logs, the notary denial, and the original email together into an unbreakable net. I liked how the evidence operated like a military supply line, where no single link had to carry the entire weight of the truth. While organizing the printed emails, a specific sentence caught my eye and sent a new wave of tension through my shoulders. Kelsey had written a frantic message to my parents a month ago. "Owen and his family expect the house before the wedding," the text read. My stomach turned at the thought of the groom, orchestrating the theft from the shadows, pressing my sister for property he felt entitled to own. I sent a quick text to my cousin Aaron, asking casually how the groom was handling the upcoming property transfer. Aaron replied almost instantly, noting that Owen spoke about the house as a beautiful, spontaneous surprise gift from a generous older sister. He clearly believed the narrative my family had spun for the general public. I took a red pen and drew a circle around Owen's name, moving him into the unknown column. He was not cleared of suspicion yet, but I refused to convict a man without seeing the digital receipts first. The legal perimeter finally began to close by late afternoon. Naomi confirmed that the formal revocation had reached both the title company and the lending firm, shutting down the machinery my father had set in motion. The title processor officially closed the transfer file because of the fraud dispute, meaning no lien arising from this attempted transaction could attach to my property without an entirely new transfer and direct, independently verified authorization from me. I spent the next hour systematically stripping away any lingering access my family might hold. I changed the passwords to all my utility accounts, revoked my old cloud storage permissions, and set up a motion-activated document camera directly over my home office desk. The quiet click of the new locks turning felt like an anchor dropping into solid ground. For the first time in 6 weeks, my shoulders dropped away from my ears, and I slept for 4 uninterrupted hours on the living room sofa. I woke up to a final message from my attorney, containing the official confirmation of the loan portal upload and a chilling observation. "Kelsey undoubtedly created the fake document and uploaded it," Naomi said, her voice dropping into a solemn register. "But someone much older taught her that a real signature later could easily erase a fake one right now." I sat up, the fabric of the sofa cushion scratching against my cheek. I looked down at the dining table, my eyes landing perfectly on the quitclaim deed, staring directly at the bold, confident signature of Gerald Monroe. The bold, confident signature of Gerald Monroe stared back at me from the glowing screen, anchoring my father to a crime I had desperately wanted to blame entirely on my sister. For weeks, a quiet, naive part of my brain had maintained a fragile defense for my parents. I had convinced myself that Kelsey manipulated them, that they were simply caught in the crossfire of her extravagant wedding demands and panicked under the pressure. That comforting illusion shattered completely the following morning when the private lender released the original email chain attached to the loan file. Naomi forwarded the correspondence just after sunrise, adding a brief note advising me to sit down before reading. The lender had required written explanation for the delayed title transfer before they disbursed the final $8,000 of the $72,000 bridge loan. Kelsey had forwarded a private family email thread to the bank representative, carelessly including the entire history of their internal conversation. I zoomed in on the text, tracing the words with a cold fingertip. The first message belonged to Kelsey, complaining that the title company was moving too slowly. "The fake papers just need to be good enough to get the money released for the venue," my sister had typed. "Tessa will eventually sign the real ones to save the wedding." My father responded less than 20 minutes later. The man who had spent my entire childhood lecturing me about the value of a hard day of work had laid out a deliberate strategy for financial fraud. "Once Tessa signs the real deed, nobody will care how the first version was prepared," Gerald wrote. "The final signature cleans up the entire paper trail." My stomach dropped, leaving a hollow, aching cavity behind my ribs. But it was the third message that forced the breath from my lungs. My mother, the perpetual peacemaker who claimed she only wanted her daughters to love each other, had provided the final tactical instruction. "Do not tell her about the loan," Linda instructed. "Tell her she can attend the rehearsal dinner after she signs the house over." I read the 3 sentences again, and then a third time, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something less cruel. My hands stopped moving over the keyboard. I did not cry, and I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. A strange, suffocating quiet settled over my kitchen instead. They had not stumbled into this disaster by accident. My parents understood exactly what they were doing, calculating that a real signature extracted under extreme emotional duress would successfully erase a forged document. I pushed my chair back from the kitchen island and walked slowly down the hallway, stopping in the doorway of the spare bedroom. The morning light caught the fresh sage green paint on the walls. My family had spent the last 2 months calling this space unused and wasted, demanding I hand it over to fund a single evening of country club appetizers and imported floral arrangements. I reached out, resting my palm flat against the cool drywall. The solid structure grounded me, reminding me that the foundation I had built for myself was real, even if the family I tried to protect was not. My cell phone rang, vibrating against the hardwood floor in the living room. I walked back to answer it, finding Maya on a video call from her office in California. She took one look at my face and immediately set her pen down. "They knew everything," I told my friend, my voice sounding thin and unfamiliar in my own ears. "They planned it." Maya did not offer empty platitudes or tell me that family was complicated. She looked directly into the camera lens, her expression fierce and unyielding. "Then you need to stop carrying the part they chose to break," she said. 2 days later, I boarded a commercial flight heading toward the West Coast. I had officially traded a week of managing floral deliveries and catering disasters in North Carolina for the crisp, salty air of the Pacific Ocean. Stepping out of the airport terminal in Southern California, I took a deep breath, letting the heavy, humid weight of my past stay entirely on the opposite side of the country. I checked into a modest, beachfront bungalow in Malibu. It was not a luxury resort, and it was certainly not the Maldives honeymoon suite my sister had purchased with my stolen equity. It was simply quiet, clean, and completely mine. The rhythmic sound of the crashing waves filtered through the open window, replacing the constant, buzzing anxiety that usually accompanied any family event. I refused to put my life on hold while waiting for their inevitable collapse. The very next morning, I set up my laptop on a small wooden desk facing the ocean and logged into a scheduled virtual meeting with my small business advisor. We spent 2 hours refining the operational logistics for my new consulting firm, mapping out the transition timeline for when my military service officially ended. By the time I closed the laptop, I had secured a verbal commitment from my very first trial client. Later that afternoon, I walked down to a local boutique on the Pacific Coast Highway and purchased a set of high-quality cotton bedsheets. They were not a wedding gift for my sister. They were meant for the spare bedroom back in Southern Pines, preparing the space for the young female soldier who would be moving in next month. Every action I took affirmed a simple, undeniable truth. My house already had a purpose, and it did not belong to them. The final legal warning went out while I was drinking coffee on the patio. Naomi sent a formal demand letter directly to my parents and sister. The attorney instructed them to immediately withdraw the fraudulent loan application, preserve all digital data, cease using my name in any capacity, and confirm in writing that no property transfer would occur. I wanted to give the woman who raised me one final, absolute chance to step off the ledge. I opened my messaging app and typed a direct text to Linda. "Tell the truth to the lender and the guests before the wedding begins," I wrote. "I will not punish honesty." The response arrived 5 minutes later. "A good daughter would not make her mother choose between her children," Linda replied. I stared at the screen, watching a seagull dive toward the water in the distance. My mother still believed she held the moral high ground, convinced that my refusal to be a victim was the actual crime. I locked my phone and slid it into my pocket. I did not reply. The silence was no longer a sign of fear. It was a permanent boundary. Returning to the bungalow, I pulled a small, dark velvet ring box from my travel bag. I opened the lid, removing the silver ribbon entirely, and took out the old brass key I had carried in my pocket for years. Naomi had spent the morning preparing a specific stack of documents for me, carefully printing copies that were clearly marked and legally safe to distribute. The original files remained heavily guarded in her office, safe and locked within the lender digital servers. I folded the replicated documents into tight squares. The stack included the legitimate limited power of attorney, the forged version with the unauthorized real estate clause, the damning email chain between the three of them, and the official notice of the lender fraud review. I placed the folded papers at the bottom of the velvet box, resting the brass key perfectly on top of the evidence. Finally, I wrote a short note on a piece of thick cardstock. "The house was never yours, the transfer was never valid, and the originals are already beyond your reach," the note read. I placed the card inside, snapped the velvet lid shut, and tied a fresh silver ribbon around the package. I addressed the outer shipping envelope directly to Kelsey, adding a specific delivery instruction to the courier service. "For the bride," I wrote on the label, Please open during the family toast. I knew my mother better than anyone. Linda would never allow a gift from her absent military daughter to be opened in private. She would demand a public spectacle, using the box to showcase her perfect family to hundreds of wealthy guests. I was simply providing the props for the stage she had already built. I walked to the local shipping center and handed the package to the courier. The clerk scanned the barcode, printing a receipt with a required signature confirmation. When the heavy glass door of the post office closed behind me, a sudden wave of apprehension washed over my chest. I was not afraid of losing the house anymore. I was terrified, because I knew that the moment Kelsey pulled that ribbon, the door to my childhood family would swing shut and lock forever. My phone chimed with a message from Naomi as I walked back toward the beach. The lender just locked the copies inside the loan portal, the attorney wrote. They also sent a formal preservation notice to the electronic signature platform. The audit trail is completely frozen, and they cannot silently overwrite the history files. 2 days passed in a quiet, peaceful blur of ocean sun and strategic planning. On the afternoon of the wedding, I sat on my balcony, watching the tide roll back. My phone buzzed against the patio table, displaying an automated update from the shipping carrier. The bold green letters confirmed the package had been officially delivered and signed for at the North Carolina Country Club. A minute later, a text message from Linda lit up the screen. I knew you would finally come to your senses and do the right thing, my mother wrote. I read her words, listening to the waves crash against the shoreline. She believed I had surrendered, interpreting the small velvet box as the ultimate symbol of my submission. I looked out at the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, breathing in the clean air, and chose not to correct her misunderstanding. She was about to learn the truth in front of 300 people. The California sun hung low over the Pacific Ocean, casting long golden shadows across the wooden deck of the bungalow. 4:15 on the West Coast meant 7:15 in North Carolina. My family would be taking their seats for the formal reception dinner right now. The ocean breeze carried the sharp scent of salt water and blooming jasmine, but my attention remained entirely fixed on the black smartphone resting silently on the patio table. Maya sat across from me, nursing a glass of iced tea. She watched my eyes dart toward the screen for the 5th time in 10 minutes. You can turn that off, you know, Maya said softly, leaning back in her chair. You do not have to watch them. I just need to know. The box was opened, I replied, running a thumb along the condensation of my own glass. I need to know they did not try to forge another signature while the guests were distracted. A sudden chime cut through the sound of the crashing waves. Naomi sent a brief update from her office. The attorney confirmed the house was officially secured. The title company had closed their file permanently, and the lending firm remained locked in a formal fraud review. No new liens could touch the property. The foundation of my life was safe. Now, the people who tried to steal it were about to collide with a brick wall. My cousin Aaron sent a text message exactly 3 minutes later. Linda just added a special gift presentation to the family toast schedule, the message read. Mom is telling everyone the gift is from the bride's heroic sister who could not leave her military post. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. My mother had effectively banned me from attending the wedding, and yet she was still utilizing my uniform to harvest sympathy from her wealthy country club friends. Do you want me to call you on video? Aaron texted. I picked up the phone. Yes. Do not argue with anyone and do not step close to the documents. Just point the camera. The video call connected with a burst of static, quickly clearing to reveal the grand ballroom of the Charlotte Country Club. Hundreds of crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over massive floral centerpieces and tables draped in imported silk. The noise of clinking silverware and overlapping conversations echoed through the small speaker. Erin held her phone discreetly near her chest, positioned perfectly by the edge of the front row. Linda stood at the center of the polished dance floor, wearing an elaborate silver gown and holding a microphone. Kelsey and Owen sat at a sweetheart table directly behind her, looking like the absolute picture of newlywed perfection. My father hovered near the edge of the stage, his chest puffed out in a tailored tuxedo. He looked incredibly confident, wearing the expression of a man who believed he had just closed the most lucrative deal of his entire career. Sitting directly in front of the bride was the dark velvet ring box. My oldest daughter, Tessa, could not be here tonight, Linda announced to the crowded room, letting her voice tremble with practiced emotion. Military duty called her away, but she wanted to make sure Kelsey and Owen started their new life with the most incredible blessing. Applause rippled through the audience. Kelsey stood up, her heavily beaded gown shimmering under the lights, and stepped toward the velvet box. She pulled the silver ribbon loose. The fabric slipped away, pooling on the white tablecloth. My sister lifted the lid. She reached inside and pulled out the old brass key, holding it up high for the entire room to see. "I knew she would do the right thing," Kelsey said into the microphone, flashing a triumphant smile toward our parents. Guests clapped louder, raising their champagne flutes. Linda wiped a delicate tear from her cheek. Gerald nodded at Owen, a silent, approving gesture between two men who seemingly understood the value of real estate. Then, Kelsey reached back into the box to pull out the velvet lining. Through the grainy video feed, I watched the exact second the triumphant smile melted off my sister's face. Kelsey stared down into the box, her eyes widening in absolute horror. She saw the stack of folded papers. The legitimate limited power of attorney sat right next to the forged version. The bright red ink marking the unauthorized editions glared up at her. Beneath those documents lay the printed email chain where she had openly discussed faking the paperwork. Kelsey let out a piercing, guttural scream. Her hand jerked back. The brass key slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. The heavy stack of evidence spilled over the edge of the table, scattering across the polished wood. The music abruptly stopped. The applause died instantly. Owen frowned, stepping around the table to check on his new wife. He bent down and picked up a piece of paper near his shoe. It was the official notice from the private lender regarding the active fraud review. "Kelsey," Owen said, his voice carrying clearly over the dead silence of the ballroom. "Did you borrow money against a house that was never yours?" Panic completely overtook her features. "Tessa is doing this to ruin my day," Kelsey shrieked, grabbing at the papers in his hand. "She is retaliating. Those documents are distorted." The tension in the room snapped. Gerald lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers off the floor before anyone else could read them. His face was bright red, completely stripped of his earlier confidence. "It was only temporary until she signed the real deed," my father blurted out, his loud voice echoing across the silent room. Linda whipped her head around, staring at her husband in sheer terror. The microphone was still clutched in her hand, broadcasting her frantic whisper to every single guest. "You said the first document could not be traced." A collective gasp swept through the front tables. The wedding videographer, a young man hired to capture the magical evening, remained perfectly still in the corner. His camera lens was pointed directly at my parents, recording their panicked confessions in high-definition audio. Kelsey spun around, frantically searching the crowd for a lifeline. Her eyes landed on Aaron. She saw the glowing screen of the cell phone and realized I was watching. "You set us up," Kelsey screamed at the phone lens, tears ruining her careful makeup. "You planned this." I leaned closer to the microphone on my device. My voice remained completely steady. "I gave you a way to tell the truth. You chose to open the box." Owen stood completely still, staring at the woman he had married just hours ago. He looked at Gerald, then at Linda, the pieces of their massive lie finally locking together in his mind. "Did you ever intend to tell me the truth about this loan?" Owen asked. His voice sounded hollow, completely devoid of anger, which somehow made the situation significantly worse. Kelsey reached out, grabbing the lapels of his tuxedo jacket. "Please, Owen, do not make this worse in front of the guests." We can fix it. The groom slowly reached up and unpinned the white rose boutonniere from his lapel. He placed the flower gently on the table next to the scattered fraud documents. The guests did not manufacture a lie, Owen said, taking a step backward. They are just seeing it. He turned around and walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. He did not look back. Hundreds of pairs of eyes followed him out the heavy oak doors, leaving my sister standing alone in her pristine white dress, surrounded by the physical proof of her own greed. I tapped the red button on my screen, ending the video call. The sudden silence of the Malibu evening rushed back in, broken only by the distant crashing of the tide. I sat perfectly still, staring at the black glass of the phone. The adrenaline that had kept my spine rigid for the last 20 minutes suddenly evaporated. A violent tremor started in my hands, spreading quickly up my arms until my entire body shook. I had won the legal battle, and I had protected my home, but the sheer reality of watching my family implode left a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. Maya reached across the table and placed a cold glass of water directly into my shaking hands. She did not offer empty congratulations or tell me I had executed a brilliant strategy. She simply waited until I took a sip and my breathing steadied. "What do you want to do in the next hour?" Maya asked gently. "I want to go eat dinner," I replied, forcing my fingers to loosen their death grip on the glass, somewhere loud. I picked up my phone to silence the notifications, knowing my relatives would be flooding my voicemail within minutes. Just before the screen locked, a text message from Naomi pushed through the alerts. The attorney had sent a single, urgent sentence. "Kelsey just logged into the loan portal and tried to remove the files," Naomi wrote. My sister had not learned a single lesson from the public disaster. Instead of confessing, her very first instinct upon realizing her husband had left was to attempt a digital cover-up, but the audit trail kept every step, Naomi added a moment later. The scream at the country club was no longer just a moment of public humiliation. It had officially transformed into the exact catalyst for a criminal investigation. The morning sun crept across the wooden floorboards of the Malibu bungalow, bringing a deceptive warmth to the quiet room. My cell phone sat exactly where I had abandoned it the night before, resting next to a half-empty glass of water. A solid red circle hovered over the voicemail icon, displaying 32 missed calls. My family had spent the entire night spinning their narrative to anyone who would listen. I poured a cup of black coffee, sat down at the small patio table, and pressed play. My mother struck first. Linda left 4 separate messages, her voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. She told my aunts and uncles that I had mailed vicious legal threats to a highly stressed bride, deliberately trying to ruin a beautiful celebration out of sheer spite. My father took a different approach. Gerald left a booming, angry recording, claiming the shock of my cruel stunt had nearly given him a heart attack and caused my mother to collapse in the country club parking lot. He did not mention any actual hospital visits or medical treatment, leaning entirely on the dramatic imagery of a ruined evening. Listening to their desperate attempts at damage control made my stomach turn, but I refused to engage in a public shouting match. Instead of returning a single call, I drafted one concise message and copied it to every relative who had reached out. "The matter is currently being handled by my attorney, and I will not debate legal facts over the internet," the text read. I hit send, effectively shutting down their primary weapon of family gossip. Kelsey, however, preferred a much wider audience. A notification popped up on my screen, highlighting a new public post on my sister's social media page. The photograph featured a black background with a single broken heart emoji. Beneath the image, Kelsey had written a vague, tearful paragraph about family betrayal. She claimed her military sister was using high-level government connections to destroy a sacred wedding day, portraying herself as the helpless victim of an institutional attack. I did not use my military rank to strike back, and I certainly did not ask anyone at the base to issue a statement. I captured the post, its publication time, the visible comments, and the account information before forwarding everything to Naomi. Naomi sent a preservation notice requiring Kelsey to retain the original post, comments, direct messages, and account analytics. She also demanded that Kelsey stop publishing new statements using my name or implying that the military was involved in the dispute. Once the relevant material had been preserved, the public post disappeared from view. The original data, however, remained available through the account records and Naomi's authenticated capture. By noon, the coastal fog had burned off completely, leaving a brilliant blue sky over the Pacific. Naomi called my phone, her voice carrying a rare note of genuine surprise. "Owen Bennett just reached out to my office," the attorney said, the sound of a keyboard clicking echoing through the line. "He did not ask to speak with you directly. He just wanted to provide his own receipts." A tight knot of lingering doubt finally released in my chest. I opened the encrypted folder Naomi sent over, finding dozens of text messages between the bride and groom. Kelsey had repeatedly assured Owen that the Southern Pines property was a spontaneous, fully signed surprise gift from a generous older sister. A forwarded email from my mother sat at the bottom of the stack, explicitly backing up the story. Linda had written that I absolutely loved making grand gestures and wanted to secure their financial future. The groom had not orchestrated the theft at all. Owen was completely innocent, lured into a marriage built on a foundation of stolen equity and synchronized lies. That revelation shifted the legal landscape significantly, but the private lender possessed an even sharper weapon. Fraud investigators had spent the morning pulling the access history from their internal systems. Naomi explained the findings while I watched a group of surfers paddle out into the ocean waves. The audit trail inside the loan portal recorded a flurry of desperate activity late last night, Naomi reported. After receiving our formal preservation notice, the borrower account registered to Kelsey logged in from a local North Carolina internet address. She attempted to delete an entire folder of uploaded documents, renamed several key files, and uploaded a hastily altered replacement page. My sister thought she could sneak into the digital filing cabinet and burn the evidence, but the electronic signature platform operated on an entirely different level of security. The secondary system had received the same preservation notice and immediately locked down the certificates of completion, timestamps, and origin logs. The lender did not need to confiscate Kelsey's personal computer or hack into her private cloud storage. They only had to look at the unalterable history of their own receiving platform. Even an old affidavit my mother had submitted weeks ago showed signs of tampering. The system flagged an attempt to overwrite the original sworn statement with a much shorter, vague paragraph. The frantic digital cover-up did not automatically prove the initial forgery, but the intent to hide documents immediately after a legal warning painted a damning picture of guilt. Late in the afternoon, my phone rang again. The screen displayed an unknown local number, but the heavy breathing on the other end gave away the caller instantly. "Tessa," my father said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register. Gerald sounded exhausted, stripped of his usual booming authority. "We can make this entire wedding incident go away if you just work with us." I kept the phone pressed to my ear, waiting for the inevitable negotiation. "If you drop this ridiculous fraud complaint with the bank, we will forget the stunt you pulled at the reception," Gerald continued, attempting to frame his massive crime as a mutual misunderstanding. "You can loan us the cash to pay the lender back, and we will set up a payment plan. If you do not help us right now, your mother and I could lose our house." My hands gripped the wooden railing of the balcony. They were still trying to manipulate the scales, offering me a pardon for a crime I never committed in exchange for my financial rescue. "You asked me to lose my home so you could keep pretending," I replied, making sure every single word landed with absolute clarity. "I will not finance the lie, Dad." I ended the call, blocking the unknown number immediately. I did not promise to send them to prison, and I did not raise my voice in anger. I simply refused to be their collateral damage any longer. The final nail in their defense strategy arrived just as the sun began to set. Naomi called to confirm that she had successfully matched my mother's sworn affidavit against my official military deployment logs. Linda had signed a legal document claiming I asked her to forge my signature because I was stationed overseas on a specific date. Naomi pulled an old email from our family archive. On the exact date Linda claimed I was unreachable across the globe, my mother had sent me a recipe for chicken casserole to my base address in North Carolina. Linda knew perfectly well that I was not standing in front of a notary, yet she deliberately swore otherwise to secure the bridge loan. Combined with the wedding video footage of Linda admitting the first document could not be traced, the evidence crossed a critical threshold. The private lender officially transferred the matter to their criminal referral division while simultaneously preparing a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen funds. I packed my small suitcase, preparing for the flight back to reality. The bungalow felt remarkably peaceful, a quiet sanctuary before the impending storm. The legal machinery was moving entirely on its own now, driven by the cold, hard facts my family had provided through their own arrogance. My phone vibrated against the bedside table, displaying an urgent message from Naomi. The attorney had just received a formal update from the lending institution. "The bank just called the personal guarantees," Naomi wrote. "Gerald and Linda have exactly 30 days to repay the entire $72,000 balance, plus penalties, or face immediate collection actions against their secondary assets. 30 days. A month to find tens of thousands of dollars they did not have." A second message chimed immediately after the first, slipping through my blocked caller list by coming from my cousin Aaron's compromised account. It was Linda. My mother had bypassed the blocks to deliver one final, desperate accusation. "You are going to make us lose our home," the message read. I stared at the glowing letters, letting the absolute irony of her statement wash over me. She had aimed a weapon directly at my sanctuary, missed completely, and now blamed me for the bullet hitting her own front door. The threat of losing their suburban home did not inspire my parents to apologize. It simply forced them into a windowless conference room in downtown Charlotte. 4 weeks after the disastrous country club reception, I sat next to Naomi at a long mahogany table for an expedited pre-suit mediation requested by the lender before it began full collection proceedings against the personal guarantors. The air conditioning hummed loudly, chilling the air until my fingers felt stiff. Across the polished wood, the united front of the Monroe family had completely shattered. Kelsey sat at the far end of the room, positioned rigidly next to her own defense attorney. She wore a plain gray sweater, her face pale and entirely devoid of the radiant bridal glow she had weaponized just a month ago. My parents sat several feet away from her, flanked by a different legal team. They were no longer a family. They were simply 3 separate liabilities desperately trying to offload their shared debt. Linda caught my eye across the table. Her lips trembled, forming a fragile, pleading smile. "Sweetheart," my mother whispered, leaning forward, "we are all so tired." I looked at the woman who had signed a false affidavit to steal my future. I felt nothing but a profound, hollow exhaustion. I turned my head slightly, addressing my own counsel. "Please remind the opposing parties that all communication goes through you, Naomi," I said quietly. The mediator cleared his throat, shuffling a thick stack of manila folders. The private lender wanted their $72,000 back, plus mounting legal fees and default interest. Since none of the defendants possessed the liquid cash, the session rapidly deteriorated into a vicious game of pointing fingers. Kelsey struck first. Her lawyer presented a narrative of youthful ignorance, claiming my sister was completely overwhelmed by wedding planning. The defense argued that Gerald had assured Kelsey the power of attorney could be legally amended. According to their version of events, the young bride simply followed her father's misguided instructions, believing a real signature later would magically fix the paperwork. Naomi did not raise her voice or pound her fist on the table. She simply slid a printed packet across the mahogany surface. "The audit trail from the loan portal tells a very different story," Naomi stated. The borrower account registered to Kelsey uploaded the altered document weeks after the date written on the paper. Furthermore, the loan application itself contains explicit financial statements made directly by your client. Naomi paused, pulling a second sheet of paper from her file. We also have preserved text messages provided by Owen Bennett. In those exchanges, Kelsey repeatedly assured her groom that the house was a finalized, legally transferred gift. She was not a confused bystander. She actively managed the deception on multiple fronts. Kelsey shrank back into her leather chair. Her eyes darted toward the floor, realizing her carefully constructed victim narrative could not survive the digital receipts. My father refused to absorb the blame. Gerald leaned over the table, his face flushed a dark, angry red. He insisted he only sign the documents where his daughter instructed him to sign. He claimed he did not understand the complex terms of the private bridge loan and was simply trying to help his child secure a venue deposit. "I am a construction manager, not a banking expert," Gerald snapped, glaring at Naomi. My attorney calmly opened a laptop sitting in front of us. She turned the screen so the entire room could view the display, tapping a single button to play an audio file extracted from the wedding videographer's raw footage. It was only temporary until she signed the real deed. My father's own voice echoed loudly through the sterile conference room, captured perfectly during his country club panic. Naomi let the silence hang for a moment before sliding another printed document forward. "You understood the situation perfectly, Gerald. You signed the quitclaim deed explicitly as an attorney, in fact, claiming legal authority you knew you lacked. We also have your email confirming that a later signature would cover up the initial forgery. Finally, your personal signature is right here on the guarantee, directly tying you to the funds." Gerald gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. The man who had demanded total obedience from me my entire life suddenly looked incredibly small, trapped inside a prison of his own written words. With her husband and daughter pinned by evidence, Linda attempted a final, desperate maneuver. My mother pulled a tissue from her purse, dabbing her dry eyes while her lawyer argued that she was merely a naive housewife. The attorney claimed Linda simply wanted to keep the family together and had no idea the financial documents were fraudulent. Naomi did not even wait for the defense lawyer to finish speaking. She placed the sworn affidavit exactly in the center of the table. "Your client signed a statement under penalty of perjury," Naomi explained smoothly. Linda claimed her oldest daughter begged her to sign the papers due to an overseas military deployment. We have corresponding emails proving Linda knew Tessa was stationed in North Carolina on that exact date. She also sent a text message delivering a clear ultimatum regarding wedding attendance, and she instructed her family to delete their correspondence after receiving our legal preservation notice. I watched my mother stare at the affidavit. The evidence did not reveal a grand evil mastermind. It simply exposed a woman who made a consistent series of small, incredibly selfish choices, sacrificing one child to maintain the illusion of a perfect life for the other. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The mediator recognized the absolute deadlock and called for a brief recess. The opposing legal teams huddled in the corners, whispering frantically. A few minutes later, the attorney representing my parents approached Naomi with a single sheet of paper. It was a drafted statement of reconciliation. The document proposed that I formally acknowledge a genuine family misunderstanding regarding the property. If I signed the paper claiming I had previously considered gifting the house, the lender might reduce the fraud penalties, allowing my parents to refinance their debt instead of facing immediate foreclosure. In exchange, Gerald and Linda promised to issue a private apology and agree to a permanent no-contact order. I stared at the blank signature line. A powerful, familiar wave of guilt washed over my chest. That single stroke of a pen could save the house I grew up in. It could rescue my parents from public ruin and financial devastation. For 38 years, my designated role in the family had been the ultimate shock absorber. I just had to absorb one final blow. "You do not have to sign anything," Naomi reminded me quietly, watching my face closely. I picked up the pen, feeling the smooth plastic against my fingertips. I looked across the room at my parents. They were not watching me with love or remorse. They were watching me with hungry, desperate expectation. They still fully believed my boundaries were negotiable. I set the pen down, pushing the paper back across the table. "I will not sign a false statement," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I will sign a document confirming the exact truth." I offered a $10,000 gift, and I gave them a private deadline to withdraw the fraudulent paperwork before the wedding. That is the only reality I will verify. The refusal killed the settlement instantly. Because no one would admit total fault and the lender demanded full restitution, the mediation ended without an agreement. The civil claims would proceed to a formal judgment, and the criminal referral remained completely outside my control. The consequences were finally rolling forward under their own momentum. I packed my notes into my leather satchel and walked out into the brightly lit hallway. I was halfway to the elevator bank when footsteps echoed rapidly behind me. Linda stepped in front of the elevator doors, blocking my path. Her pristine facade had finally crumbled, leaving her face pale and her hair slightly unkempt. "How can you do this, Tessa?" she asked, her voice cracking with genuine panic. "How can you stand there and let us lose our home?" I stopped walking. I looked at the woman who had raised me, feeling the last remaining thread of my childhood obligations snap and dissolve into nothing. "I am not taking your house," I replied, holding her gaze until she finally looked away. "I am refusing to give you mine." I stepped around her, pressing the elevator call button. The metal doors opened, and I walked inside without looking back. The elevator was descending to the lobby when Naomi's phone buzzed loudly in the quiet space. The attorney pulled the device from her pocket, scanning a new email message. A sharp breath escaped her lips. "The dynamics just shifted entirely," Naomi said, turning the screen toward me. Kelsey had just directed her defense lawyer to contact the prosecutor. The golden child realized she could not outrun the audit logs, and she was officially requesting a plea deal. To avoid a maximum sentence, the perfect bride was fully prepared to testify against her own parents. The heavy glass doors of the courthouse clicked shut behind me, sealing away the sound of my family's legal collapse. I walked toward the parking garage, the concrete beneath my boots feeling solid and permanent. Over the next 6 months, my life transformed into a quiet, efficient series of legal obligations that existed entirely separate from my daily reality. There were long afternoon interviews with investigators, endless requests for digital document preservation, and several tense meetings with Naomi to refine my testimony. Each meeting felt like cleaning out a clogged drainage system, removing the debris of past lies until the water could finally run clear. While the legal storm raged, I continued building the life I had chosen for myself. My logistics consulting business officially launched, and the first client, a medium-sized transport firm based in Richmond, signed a retainer agreement during my lunch break. I painted the trim in my spare bedroom a soft, calming shade of blue and assembled a desk beneath the window. The room was being prepared for Leah, a young female soldier rebuilding her life after a controlling relationship. Before approving the arrangement, I reviewed the written agreement with her over a video call. It contained a fixed move-in date, clear expectations, shared utility costs, and absolutely no emotional debt. Leah would move in after the sentencing hearing. Preparing the room reminded me that I could support another person without surrendering control of my home or becoming a permanent rescuer. The formal plea agreements reached Naomi's office in late winter. Kelsey obtained a limited reduction in her recommended sentence only after entering a formal proffer agreement. She consented to forensic imaging of her phone and laptop, surrendered private email threads that had never been uploaded to the lender's portal, and identified the shared folder where early drafts of the forged document had been stored. More importantly, she agreed to testify that Gerald instructed her to reuse the old power of attorney and assured her that my later signature would erase the original fraud. She also provided messages showing that Linda knowingly drafted the false explanation about my deployment before signing the affidavit. Kelsey had not produced the lender's audit trail. The lender already possessed that evidence. She had traded previously hidden communications and direct testimony against her parents for a narrower sentencing recommendation. Gerald later accepted a plea agreement that preserved his felony conviction and full restitution obligation. Linda admitted knowingly submitting the false affidavit and helping conceal the loan after receiving the preservation notice. They were finally being held accountable for their own signatures, and the silence in my house felt like a profound, long overdue peace. The financial fallout proved to be far more damaging than the social disgrace. The bridge loan carried a principal amount of $72,000, but after adding the default interest, significant legal fees, the civil judgment, and the court-ordered restitution, the total liability exceeded $100,000. My parents possessed no liquid savings to cover a debt of that size. They held the personal guarantees they had signed during their desperate attempt to secure the wedding venue, leaving them legally vulnerable to every creditor involved. To generate the necessary liquidity and avoid a lengthy, humiliating foreclosure process, they were forced to sell the family home in the suburbs. The news reached me through Aaron, who sent a photograph of a bold, bright red sold sign driven into the lawn where we used to take our childhood birthday pictures. I looked at the image on my screen for only a second before deleting the message. I did not purchase the property. I did not attend the final walkthrough. And I certainly did not send money to help them relocate. The poetic justice of them losing the very symbol they had tried to weaponize against me carried its own weight, requiring no celebration from me. A week after the house sale finalized, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was from Linda. I opened the letter in the kitchen, reading her shaky, looped handwriting. My mother claimed I had achieved my cruel goal, asking if watching my parents lose everything actually brought me happiness. Buried in the third paragraph, however, a sentence stood out that betrayed the entire foundation of their scheme. "We never thought you would actually say no," the letter read. I stood there for a long time, holding the paper over the trash can. That single line revealed the absolute core of our conflict. For my entire life, they had operated on the unspoken assumption that my love was a commodity I was forced to trade for their approval. They never believed I possessed the authority to say no. I tore the letter into small, neat strips and dropped them into the recycling bin, feeling no satisfaction, only a deep and final clarity. Kelsey sent a typed letter a few days later, forwarded by her own attorney. She offered an apology, but it felt thin and hollow, heavily weighted with references to wedding stress and the crushing pressure my father had applied. She regretted the consequences far more than she regretted the act of betrayal itself. I started to draft a response, explaining exactly why her actions had permanently damaged the trust between us, but I stopped halfway through. The urge to explain myself had finally withered away, replaced by the realization that my silence now served as the ultimate boundary. I deleted the draft. Leah walked into the kitchen as I was finishing my coffee, looking hesitant. "Do you want me to leave for a few days when your family visits for the sentencing hearing?" the young soldier asked. I shook my head, keeping my eyes on the horizon beyond the kitchen window. "No one has permission to enter this house unless I invite them," I said, my voice steady. "You are safe here." The sentencing hearing day finally arrived, a gray, overcast morning that matched the gravity of the legal process. Naomi met me at the courthouse entrance, handing me a folder containing my victim impact statement. The prosecutor had encouraged me to present the document personally, emphasizing that the court needed to understand the pattern of financial abuse that had spanned nearly a decade. I walked toward the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone floor. I took a deep breath and entered the room. My parents and my sister sat in the defendant chairs, but they were no longer a unified dominant force. They appeared small, broken, and completely disconnected from each other. The courtroom felt cold, sterile, and intensely focused. I walked to the podium, the wood smooth and hard beneath my palms. I did not stand there to vent rage, and I did not stand there to beg for mercy. I simply spoke the truth. I told the judge about the years I spent securing their financial stability, only to have my own identity used as collateral for a luxury party. I described the specific emotional pressure they applied, turning every act of love I had ever shown them into evidence that I had no right to live my own life. I did not ask for a specific prison sentence, and I did not offer a manufactured forgiveness. I stood straight, looked directly at the judge, and finished my statement with a firm resolve. I am asking the court to let the consequences belong to the people who created them. I stepped down from the podium and sat in the gallery, watching as the legal process took its final turn. Kelsey was sentenced to 15 months of actual incarceration, to be followed by a long period of supervised probation and mandatory restitution. The felony conviction cost her the financial sector position she already held and made future employment involving fiduciary responsibility, licensing, or access to client funds extremely difficult. The lifestyle she had fought so hard to maintain collapsed with it. She looked toward the gallery, her eyes red and swollen, clearly waiting for some sign of maternal protection or sisterly rescue. I kept my gaze forward, watching the judge instead. I would not be the person who stepped in to save her from the life she had actively constructed. Gerald received 10 months of actual incarceration, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and a court-ordered obligation to pay his portion of the restitution. The judge emphasized that he had not merely signed a document without understanding it. He had used false authority to execute the quitclaim deed, guaranteed the loan, and instructed the others that my later signature would conceal the original fraud. He lost the suburban house, his professional credibility, and his ability to demand my obedience. During a brief moment when the defense attorney spoke to him, my father looked briefly toward the gallery, his face a mask of confusion. He still seemed to be waiting for the moment I would stand up and offer to fix it for him. Linda received 6 months of home confinement, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, community service, and joint restitution obligations. The court also prohibited her from contacting me directly or attempting to access, discuss, or interfere with my property and financial records. She lost her social standing in the church and the community groups she had curated for decades. As the bailiff began to move the defendants toward the side exit, my mother looked at me, her arms reaching out in a final, pathetic gesture of entitlement. She asked for a hug. I stood up, adjusting my jacket, and offered a soft, negative shake of my head. "Not today," I said, my voice remaining quiet and entirely detached. I did not offer them hatred, and I did not offer them reconciliation. I simply offered them the reality of their own choices. I walked out of the courtroom, pushing through the heavy double doors and stepping out into the bright, sharp air of the afternoon. My life was finally, completely mine. The courtroom doors swung shut behind me, the heavy wooden panels acting as a final barrier against the life I had meticulously dismantled. I walked toward the courthouse exit, my heels clicking a steady, confident rhythm on the marble floor. The legal battle had concluded, yet the victory did not taste like triumph. It tasted like quiet. It tasted like the absence of a constant, nagging emergency. I drove back to Southern Pines with the windows down, allowing the warm air of the North Carolina afternoon to fill the truck cabin. My home appeared exactly as I had left it, the sage green paint of the bungalow standing out against the backdrop of dark pines. I pulled into the driveway, killed the engine, and took a long moment to just sit in the silence. The first thing I did was call the local locksmith. I watched from the front porch as the technician removed the old cylinders, his drill buzzing with a sharp industrial sound. Though my family no longer possessed a legal key that could operate the locks, replacing them felt like performing an essential act of internal housekeeping. I wanted the physical transition to match the mental one. Once the technician finished and handed me the new set of heavy keys, I walked to the hallway closet where I kept my secure storage. After the case closed, Naomi returned the old brass key that investigators had collected with the documents from the wedding. I held it for a moment, remembering the sound it made when it struck the country club floor. It had served its purpose, but it no longer opened any door in my life. I placed it inside a small wooden box with the final court order and closed the lid. It was no longer evidence I needed to study or a symbol I needed to carry. Then I hung the new set of keys on the hook inside the entryway. The house felt lighter, the air circulating with a crisp, renewed clarity. I walked to the kitchen and crossed out my parents' names from the emergency contact list posted on the refrigerator, replacing the space with Maya's number. It was a small, seemingly insignificant action, but my hands remained perfectly still as I wrote the new digits. I was reclaiming the small territories of my own existence, one line at a time. My laptop sat on the kitchen island, already blinking with a new notification. It was a digital contract from the logistics firm in Richmond, waiting for my final electronic signature to cement our first long-term project. I sat down and read the terms, noting the specific deliverables and the generous payment schedule. I signed the document without hesitation. For the first time, my labor belonged to me, and the financial rewards would build my own foundation rather than settling someone else's debt. Leah walked into the kitchen as I finished, holding 2 heavy suitcases. She looked around the living room, her eyes wide with a mix of relief and hesitation. "Is this room really available for me?" Leah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I do not want to be a burden like I was before." I stood up and walked over to her, taking one of the suitcases to lighten her load. "You are not a burden, Leah. You are a tenant. We have a clear contract, clear expectations, and you have your own space here for as long as you need it to get back on your feet." "Does it come with any hidden conditions?" she asked, looking up at me with searching eyes. I smiled, a genuine expression that reached my eyes for the first time in months. "The only condition is that you respect the house, pay your portion of the utilities on time, and build your own life. There is no family debt here, and there never will be." Leah exhaled a long, shaky breath, her shoulders finally losing the tension she had carried since she arrived. We spent the evening moving her belongings into the spare bedroom, filling the empty shelves with her books and photographs. Later that night, Maya and 2 other friends from our time in the military arrived for dinner. We sat on the patio under a string of warm fairy lights, passing around large plates of food and talking about everything except the courthouse. Maya laughed at a story about our old training sergeant, her voice deep and resonant in the evening air. No one asked me to prove my worth through sacrifice, and no one demanded my money to maintain their social standing. I was surrounded by a chosen community that understood the value of boundaries, and that realization brought a warmth to my chest that no suburban family home ever had. I retreated to my office after the guests departed, noticing 3 cream-colored envelopes resting on my desk. They were from Gerald, Linda, and Kelsey, arrived by mail earlier that day. I stared at the sealed flaps for several minutes, feeling the weight of the past trying to pull me back into the old, familiar cycle of obligation. I picked up the stack, walked to the fireplace, and threw the letters into the hearth. I did not open them. I did not need to know what they had written, whether they were filled with fresh threats or pathetic pleas for mercy. The words were irrelevant to the life I was currently breathing. I struck a match, watching the paper curl and blacken until the ink turned to ash. I walked out to the back porch, where the night air was cool and filled with the scent of pine. I took the new house key from my pocket, turning it over in my fingers. It was cold, sharp, and entirely mine. I had not lost my family on the day of the wedding. I had simply stopped playing the role of the perpetual savior in a story they had written to keep me small. I was no longer the daughter who had to suffer so they could appear perfect. I was a woman who built her own doors, and more importantly, I was the only one with the authority to decide who could walk through them. The house behind me stood solid, silent, and entirely secure. I walked down the steps into the dark, quiet backyard, the grass damp with dew under my feet. Leah's laugh drifted through the open bedroom window, a light, happy sound that told me she was sleeping soundly. My own life stretched out ahead of me, a vast, unmapped territory that no one else had permission to claim. I gripped the new key, feeling the jagged edge of the metal against my palm. A boundary is not revenge. It only feels like revenge to people who built their comfort on your surrender. The truth of that sentence finally anchored itself in my mind, providing a final, unshakable peace. I stood in the darkness, watching the stars above the pine trees, and knew that I was finally home. If you find yourself constantly sacrificing your peace, your finances, or your future to keep the family dynamic stable, you must understand that your self-worth is not a currency you should spend to purchase their love. You have been taught that being a good daughter means being an endless resource, but you must realize that a boundary is not an act of hostility, it is a vital act of self-preservation. When you stop stepping in to fix the disasters they manufacture, you are not failing them. You are finally allowing them the dignity of their own consequences. True family is built on mutual respect and genuine care, not on the coerced surrender of your personal autonomy. You are the only one who can decide when your labor is a gift and when it is being stolen, and you have every right to protect the life you have worked so hard to build. No one else has the authority to claim your resources or your identity. And choosing to walk away from a structure that requires your suffering is not a betrayal of your family, but a restoration of your integrity. Never let the guilt of saying no keep you trapped in a life that was designed to keep you small, because you deserve to inhabit a future that belongs entirely to you. You are the architect of your own sanctuary, and you have the power to lock the door against anyone who treats your presence as an obligation rather than a privilege. After walking this path with Tessa, I have to ask, what is one boundary you have been afraid to set because you feared being labeled the cold one? And what would your life look like if you finally prioritized your own peace over their expectations?